A young woman walked out of a California jail in the middle of the night, barefoot, without a phone, without money. She was a scholar, a dancer, a daughter with dreams. She was last seen at a stranger's backyard. Hours later, she vanished into the canyons. What followed over the next 11 months became one of the most haunting and unanswered mysteries in California's recent history. Before we continue, if you want to see more true crime stories like this, make sure to like, share, subscribe, and click the notification bell. Your support helps bring these cases the attention they still deserve. Mitrice wasn't a drifter. She wasn't someone you'd expect to just vanish into the night. She was a college graduate, bright and ambitious, with a degree in psychology from Cal State Fullerton. Friends described her as magnetic, always smiling, always pulling people in with her warmth. But beneath that smile, something was shifting. In the weeks leading up to that night, she had been writing strange journal entries, sending cryptic texts. Some believed it was stress. Others suspected something deeper, perhaps a mental health crisis. That evening, Mitrice left work in Santa Fe Springs and stopped by her aunt's home in Inglewood. She left behind a puzzling note on her uncle's car, words that didn't quite add up. From there, she drove her black Honda Civic toward Malibu, a place she rarely visited. Hours later, she pulled into the valet lot of Jeffrey's, an upscale restaurant perched above the Pacific. The valet noticed something odd. Mitrice seemed distracted, almost dazed. She spoke in fragments, referencing things that didn't make sense. Inside the restaurant, her behavior grew stranger. She joined another table uninvited, talked about astrological signs, and laughed at things no one else understood. When the bill came, nearly $90, Mitrice said she couldn't pay it. Staff called the sheriff's department. Deputies from the Malibu Lost Hills station arrived around 10 p.m. They arrested her for defrauding an innkeeper and for possession of a small amount of marijuana found in her car. She wasn't drunk, they concluded after a field sobriety test. She wasn't violent, just off. The valet later recalled thinking she needed help, not handcuffs. By midnight, Mitrice sat in the Lost Hills jail. Her car had been towed. Her wallet, phone, and belongings were locked inside. Her mother, Latice Sutton, called the station and begged deputies not to release her daughter until morning. "She's not familiar with the area," Latice pleaded. "She doesn't have her car, her money, or a phone. Please, don't let her out there alone." But just after 12:28 a.m., deputies opened the door and let Mitrice walk into the night. No ride, no belongings, no plan. Just a young woman stepping into pitch-black canyon roads. The last official record of her at the station shows her leaving the lobby, vanishing into the darkness. Hours later, at 6:30 a.m., a homeowner in Monte would see her in his backyard, barefoot and unsettled. She said she was just resting. Then she was gone. That was the last confirmed sighting of Mitrice Richardson alive. What really happened after she left the station? Why release her at that hour with nothing? Was this negligence, or the first sign of something far more sinister? What do you think? Should the sheriff's department have kept her in custody until morning? Or do you believe something else was already in motion that night? The heavy metal door of the Lost Hills Sheriff's Station clicked shut behind her, and with it, the last traceable step of Mitrice Richardson's journey. It was just after midnight. The roads outside were pitch black, the kind of darkness only Malibu Canyon can offer. No streetlights, no steady flow of cars, just silence and shadows. Mitrice had no purse, no wallet, no phone. Her car was sitting miles away in an impound yard. Deputies noted that she had refused to call anyone for a ride, but family members later disputed that. What is certain is this: she walked out with nothing, alone. The closest town was miles away. The nearest gas station, even farther. For someone unfamiliar with the area, these hills could feel like a maze. Steep canyons dropped into thickets of brush. Mountain lions roamed the ridges. The night was cold, the kind that settles deep in your bones if you don't have a jacket. Hours later, just before sunrise, a man named Bill Smith looked out the window of his Monte home. He saw a figure in his backyard, a slender young woman, calm but out of place. She said she was just resting. Smith thought little of it at the time. By the time deputies canvassed the area, she had vanished into the brush. That sighting would become the last confirmed trace of Mitrice Richardson alive. From that point, the trail went cold. Her family woke up expecting to hear from her, but instead got silence. When LaTice Sutton called the sheriff's station later that morning, she was stunned to learn her daughter had already been released. No ride, no warning, nothing. She had begged them to hold her. Within hours, a missing persons report was filed. Deputies shrugged off initial concerns, suggesting Mitrice might have just wandered off. But LaTice knew her daughter. She was not the type to disappear voluntarily. Something was terribly wrong. By the evening of September 17, 2009, flyers with Mitrice's face were already spreading through Malibu. Search teams began combing the canyons. Deputies claimed they were doing everything they could, but family members felt differently. The case didn't have the urgency of an abduction or a homicide. To authorities, Mitrice was just another adult who'd gone missing. But as the first 24 hours bled into 48, and then into days, one thing became chillingly clear. Whatever happened after she left that jail, it wasn't just bad luck. The story wasn't adding up. Why was a young woman, obviously vulnerable, released into the night with nothing to protect her? And why, when her mother had pleaded with deputies to hold her, was that warning ignored? Do you believe the deputies' decision was simple negligence? Or do you think they knew more than they were admitting? The first night passed with no word. Then the second. By day 3, LaTice Sutton's fear had hardened into something sharper. Disbelief at the way authorities were handling her daughter's disappearance. For the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, Mitrice Richardson was a missing adult. Adults, they argued, had the right to vanish. She wasn't a child, and there was no proof she was in danger. But for LaTice and the rest of Mitrice's family, the proof was in the circumstances. Her sudden strange behavior, her release at midnight into a canyon she didn't know, with no phone, no car, no money. That wasn't independence, it was abandonment. In those early days, search efforts fell largely on the family themselves. Relatives, friends, and volunteers spread flyers across Malibu and Los Angeles. They knocked on doors. They scoured the internet for leads. A few tips trickled in. Reports of a young woman wandering the canyons, someone matching her description near Malibu Creek, a possible sighting at a gas station. But none were confirmed. Frustration grew when the sheriff's department delayed releasing key information. Surveillance footage from the jail, for example. At first, deputies insisted there was no video of Mitrice inside the station or leaving it. Weeks later, under pressure, they admitted there was. When the footage finally surfaced, it showed Mitrice walking calmly through the lobby, her demeanor oddly serene. For her family, the calmness raised even more questions. Was she disoriented? Was she masking deeper confusion? Or was there something about the footage that didn't sit right because pieces were missing? Meanwhile, LaTice pressed the sheriff's department with the same question over and over. Why did you release her in the middle of the night, when I begged you not to? Officials gave shifting answers. Some said she didn't meet the criteria to be held. Others claimed she was coherent and didn't appear mentally unstable. Yet witnesses at Jeffrey's restaurant, and even some deputies, described her behavior as unusual, erratic, and concerning. As weeks dragged on, the canyon itself became the family's adversary. Malibu's rugged terrain swallowed evidence whole. Towering brush, steep ravines, hidden trails. If Mitrice was out there, she was buried beneath a wilderness few could navigate. By October 2009, nearly a month after her disappearance, national media outlets began to take notice. But the attention brought more questions than answers. Was Mitrice suffering a mental health crisis that night? Had she fallen victim to foul play? Or had the very deputies sworn to protect her put her in harm's way? Each day without answers deepened the mystery and the pain. LaTice, sitting before television cameras, said what haunted her most was the image of her daughter walking alone into the dark. She was just a girl, LaTice said, her voice breaking, and they left her out there like she didn't matter. The truth was out there somewhere, in the canyons, in the shadows, in the silence of the people who knew more than they said. What do you think happened after Mitrice left the station? Did she vanish into the wilderness on her own? Or did someone intercept her in those dark canyon roads? By the end of September 2009, the canyon had been combed more than once, but there was no sign of Mitrice. Search teams with dogs swept trails, helicopters scanned from above, and volunteers walked mile after mile of rugged ground. Yet the result was always the same: nothing. For the Richardson family, every unanswered call, every failed search, only deepened their suspicion. This wasn't just a disappearance. Something about the sheriff's department's behavior gnawed at them. Why had they dragged their feet on releasing the surveillance footage? Why had they ignored Latice's desperate request to keep her daughter until morning? Why did deputies act as if Mitrice had simply chosen to walk away from her life? Latice's frustration boiled over in a news conference where she said plainly, "If Mitrice were blonde-haired and blue-eyed, we would not be here 4 weeks later still waiting for answers." It was a powerful accusation, one that struck at the heart of what many were already whispering. Race had played a role in how the case was treated. Meanwhile, witnesses began coming forward with strange stories. One said they'd seen a woman matching Mitrice's description walking near Cold Canyon. Another claimed they spotted her on Pacific Coast Highway. Each sighting reignited hope, but each fizzled when no evidence followed. Inside the sheriff's department, cracks were showing too. Officials offered conflicting timelines of her release. First they said she left around midnight, then 12:30 a.m. Some claimed she refused to call for a ride. Others insisted she was fine to leave. The contradictions left the family wondering. Were they being misled? Or was the truth being buried? Then came the revelation about the video. The sheriff's department had told the family no footage existed of Mitrice inside the jail. Weeks later, they admitted there was. The video, when released, showed her pacing, hands behind her back, then calmly exiting into the night. The lie about the video's existence sent the family's suspicions into overdrive. If they had hidden this, what else were they hiding? Every lead felt like a race against time. Mitrice's father, Michael Richardson, joined searches in the hills himself, walking through thickets and ravines that deputies had ignored. At one point he said, "I'm not waiting for them to find my daughter. I'll find her myself." But the days turned into weeks and then into months, and the truth of what happened in those lost hours after she left the jail remained locked in silence. What do you think the hidden video means? Was it just incompetence by the sheriff's department, or a deliberate attempt to cover up something darker? Before we continue, if you care about keeping these stories alive, take a second to like this video, share it with others, subscribe, and click the notification bell. Your support brings more attention to families still waiting for justice. By October 2009, a month had passed since Mitrice vanished. The Richardson family's lives had been consumed by flyers, interviews, press conferences, and sleepless nights. Still, there was no trace of their daughter. The official stance from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department hadn't changed. Mitrice was a missing adult, possibly wandering on her own. But to her family, the narrative felt dismissive, even insulting. They knew Mitrice wasn't just wandering. Something had gone terribly wrong. Then came the community's response. Civil rights activists and church leaders rallied around the case, pushing for more action. Vigils were held, candles lit in her name. Local TV stations began running segments about the young woman who disappeared after deputies released her in the dead of night. Public pressure was growing. It wasn't just her family calling foul. Legal experts, former officers, and everyday citizens questioned the decision to let her walk free without her belongings. Why not hold her until morning? Why not drive her somewhere safe? The release looked less like protocol and more like negligence. Still, the sheriff's department insisted they'd followed procedure. They even hinted that Mitrice might have been suffering from mental health issues, implying that her disappearance was voluntary, even predictable. The suggestion outraged her family. Latice Sutton fired back, saying her daughter had no official diagnosis and was not unstable. She was vulnerable, and the deputies knew it. Meanwhile, search teams pressed deeper into Malibu's wilderness. The terrain was brutal. Steep ridges, rattlesnakes, dense brush, canyons that swallowed sound. Volunteers said you could call someone's name and never hear a reply just a few yards away. If Mitrice had been out there, injured or disoriented, she could have been missed. As days turned into weeks, tips continued to roll in. One caller claimed they saw Mitrice hitchhiking. Another swore she was spotted near Las Vegas. Every tip sparked hope. Every dead end reopened wounds. But beneath all the noise, the central question remained unchanged. What happened in those hours between Mitrice leaving the sheriff's station and vanishing into the darkness? Some believed she had wandered into the canyon and succumbed to the elements. Others whispered darker theories, that she had been picked up, harmed, and silenced. By November, with no answers and no progress, one thing was certain. Mitrice Richardson's disappearance was no longer just a family's nightmare. It was becoming a public scandal. Do you believe Mitrice's disappearance was the result of an accident in the wilderness? Or the beginning of a cover-up no one wanted exposed? The weeks bled into months, and by December 2009, Mitrice Richardson's name had become both a rallying cry and a symbol of unanswered questions. Her face was plastered across missing posters, pinned to telephone poles, taped to shop windows from Malibu to Los Angeles. Each flyer carried the same haunting words. Have you seen her? Behind the scenes, tension between the Richardson family and the sheriff's department was reaching a breaking point. Latice Sutton felt deputies were stonewalling, withholding information that could bring her daughter home. One issue in particular lit a firestorm: the handling of surveillance footage. At first, the department claimed there was no video of Mitrice inside the jail or leaving it. Later, they admitted footage did exist. When the video was finally released, it sparked outrage. The grainy images showed Mitrice in the lobby, her hands clasped behind her back, pacing slowly, then walking out into the night. To some, she looked calm. To others, her movements seemed unsettling, as if she were masking confusion or paranoia. But what disturbed the family most wasn't just what the video showed. It was what it didn't. Whole portions of time appeared missing. The angles raised more questions than they answered. Why had the sheriff's department lied about the footage in the first place? Public pressure intensified. Activists demanded accountability. Radio shows and local news hammered the story, calling it another example of systemic neglect. The family began to suspect that the department's missteps weren't incompetence. They were deliberate. Meanwhile, search efforts continued. In January 2010, nearly 300 volunteers turned out for one of the largest organized searches in Malibu Canyon history. Helicopters circled overhead, cadaver dogs scoured the ground, and searchers pushed through unforgiving brush. Yet once again, no trace of Mitrice was found. It was as though the earth itself had swallowed her whole. And still, strange leads trickled in. A woman swore she saw Mitrice in a Las Vegas casino. Another caller said she'd been spotted in Long Beach. Each lead was chased, and each one collapsed into dust. Latice, standing before cameras, held back tears as she said, "I will not let my daughter become a statistic. Somebody knows something. Somebody out there has the answers." But the canyon stayed silent. The sheriff's department stayed defensive. And Mitrice's absence grew heavier with each passing day. What do you think about the missing portions of the surveillance video? Were they an innocent mistake, or evidence that someone didn't want the full truth revealed? By the start of 2010, the Richardson family's fight for answers had turned into a battle against time, and against a system that seemed determined to bury their daughter's case in silence. The January search, one of the largest ever organized in Malibu Canyon, ended in heartbreak. Hundreds of volunteers, helicopters, cadaver dogs, and ground teams had turned over nearly 18 square miles. Not a single trace of Mitrice was found. No clothing, no personal items, no remains, nothing. The sheriff's department called it thorough. Her family called it a failure. How could so many eyes miss even a shred of evidence? For Latice Sutton, the explanation was simple. They weren't looking in the right places, or they weren't looking hard enough. As weeks dragged on, new cracks appeared in the official narrative. Witness accounts that had been brushed aside now gained weight. Bill Smith, the The Monte resident who saw Mitrice in his backyard hours after her release was adamant that deputies had downplayed his report. "She was there," he insisted. "I told them, and they did nothing." Other locals whispered about sightings too. A woman walking near Cold Canyon, another drifting along the Pacific Coast Highway, but deputies dismissed these leads as unreliable. To Mitrice's family, it felt like every possible clue was being ignored. Then came another blow. The revelation that Mitrice's impounded car had been left unsecured for days before the family was allowed to collect it. Inside were her phone, purse, and journal, the very items that might have shed light on her state of mind. How many hands had touched that car before it was released? Had evidence been lost forever? By March 2010, 6 months had passed since her disappearance. The family's faith in law enforcement was gone. They began pressing not just for Mitrice, but for accountability. Civil rights groups, local politicians, and activists joined the chorus. Why had deputies released her alone, in the middle of the night, into a canyon notorious for its dangers? Every time the sheriff's department was asked, their answers shifted. One spokesperson said Mitrice was lucid and stable. Another admitted she had been acting odd. If they couldn't keep their own story straight, how could anyone trust them with the truth? The silence of the canyons, the evasions of deputies, and the vanishing of evidence all pointed toward one conclusion. Whatever had happened to Mitrice, the truth wasn't going to be handed over easily. What do you think? Was Mitrice's case mishandled from the very beginning? Or was something far more deliberate at work behind the scenes? Spring of 2010 arrived, and with it a grim realization. Mitrice Richardson had been gone for 6 months, and the trail was colder than ever. Her family, exhausted but unrelenting, kept pushing. They organized marches, held rallies, and gave interviews to any outlet that would listen. LaTice Sutton stood firm in front of cameras, her voice steady even when her heart was breaking. "They failed my daughter," she said of the sheriff's department, "and now they're failing to find her." The pressure was working. Reporters began digging deeper, uncovering inconsistencies in the department's handling of the case. Why had deputies claimed no video existed of Mitrice in the jail when one later surfaced? Why did accounts of her release time differ? Why were leads downplayed and sightings dismissed? Meanwhile, whispers about Mitrice's mental state grew louder. Some deputies described her as lucid, while restaurant staff recalled behavior that seemed erratic, almost manic. Her journal, later recovered from her impounded car, contained passages that hinted at racing thoughts. But was this proof of a mental health crisis, or simply the fragments of a young woman under stress? The family pushed back hard against the narrative of mental illness. Even if Mitrice had been struggling, they argued, it was all the more reason she never should have been released. She needed help, not abandonment. Then came the most haunting development yet. In May 2010, deputies quietly admitted that some of Mitrice's belongings, including her journal, may have been mishandled during the impound process. Evidence that could have shed light on her final hours might have been compromised or lost forever. By now, the case was no longer just a missing person story. It was a test of accountability, a question of whether law enforcement had covered their tracks after a catastrophic failure. As summer approached, LaTice and Mitrice's father, Michael Richardson, faced the agonizing possibility that their daughter might never come home alive. But they refused to stop. They kept pressing, kept demanding, kept searching. And in August 2010, nearly 11 months after Mitrice vanished, an unexpected call would shatter everything. Park rangers had stumbled upon human remains deep in a remote canyon, a place few people ever ventured. The nightmare had just taken a darker turn. Do you believe the discovery of Mitrice's remains was pure chance? Or had they been overlooked, or even hidden, during the earlier massive searches? Before we continue, if you believe cases like Mitrice deserve attention, please like this video, share it, subscribe, and click the notification bell. Keeping her story alive is the only way to push for answers. August 9th, 2010. Nearly a year after Mitrice vanished, the phone rang with the call her family had both dreaded and expected. Park rangers hiking through a rugged, remote section of Malibu Canyon known as Dark Canyon had found skeletal remains. The location was brutal. Steep terrain, dense brush, and rattlesnake-ridden trails. A place so isolated that even veteran searchers rarely ventured there. Just 6 miles from the Lost Hill station, yet a world away. When authorities arrived, they discovered partial remains. A skull, spinal cord, and scattered bones. Her clothing, jeans, bra, and belt, lay downhill, separated from the body. Her skeleton was partially mummified, exposed to the elements. Some pieces were missing entirely. For the family, the discovery was devastating. But what made it worse was how the remains were handled. Deputies decided to move the body before the coroner arrived. A decision that infuriated experts. Standard protocol demanded the scene be preserved until a coroner could conduct a full examination. Instead, evidence was disturbed, perhaps destroyed forever. Mitrice Sutton stood in disbelief. "They left my baby out there for nearly a year," she said. "And then when they finally find her, they mishandle the only chance we have for answers. The official cause of death? Undetermined. Too much time had passed. Too much evidence had been compromised." But the questions didn't end with the discovery. They only multiplied. How had Mitrice's body ended up in such a remote location? Could she really have navigated those treacherous canyons barefoot and alone, in the dead of night? Or had someone placed her there? And why, after the massive search in January 2010 with helicopters, cadaver dogs, and hundreds of volunteers, had the remains not been found? Some pointed to the sheriff's department's failure to search Dark Canyon thoroughly. Others whispered something more sinister, that Mitrice's body had been there all along, deliberately overlooked or worse, moved later. The contradictions grew louder. Officials insisted the terrain was too difficult, that searchers could have easily missed the remains. But for the Richardson family, the explanation rang hollow. Nearly 11 months of agony had ended not with answers, but with more haunting mysteries. What do you think? Was Mitrice's death a tragic accident in unforgiving terrain? Or does the evidence point to foul play and a possible cover-up? The discovery of Mitrice Richardson's remains should have brought closure. Instead, it opened a storm of outrage. When the news broke, the Richardson family rushed to the scene. They expected to find investigators carefully preserving evidence, treating the site like sacred ground. Instead, they found chaos. Deputies had already moved Mitrice's remains before the coroner arrived, a violation of standard procedure. Forensic experts later said valuable clues may have been lost forever. Her mother's voice shook with fury. "They left my child out there for nearly a year, and then when she was finally found, they treated her remains like they didn't matter." The coroner's office eventually ruled her cause of death as undetermined. No signs of trauma. No clear evidence of foul play, but also no way to rule it out. Too much had been disturbed. Too much time had passed. Then came the haunting detail. Her clothes weren't on her body. Her jeans, bra, and belt were found strewn further down the ravine, separated from her skeletal remains. Was it animal activity? A natural process of decomposition in rugged terrain? Or something more sinister? A sign that she hadn't died alone? For the family, the explanation didn't add up. Mitrice was last seen in Monte Nido, barefoot and unsettled, 6 miles from where her body was found. Could she really have walked that distance in the dark, over cliffs and through dense brush, without shoes or supplies? Some believed it was possible. Others found it unthinkable. The handling of the case only fueled suspicion. Deputies offered conflicting accounts of who authorized moving the body. Chain of custody records were incomplete. Key evidence, including some of her bones, was reportedly left behind in the canyon. For many, it felt less like a mistake and more like a cover-up. Meanwhile, whispers about her mental state returned. Some officials leaned on the theory that Mitrice suffered a psychotic break and wandered to her death. But her family rejected it. Even if she was in crisis, Mitrice said, they had a duty to protect her. They had a duty to keep her safe. Instead, they set her up to die. The canyon remained silent. The department remained defensive. And Mitrice's story, a young woman who entered police custody alive and never came home, grew heavier with each unanswered question. What do you believe? Could Mitrice have reached that remote canyon on her own? Or was she taken there by someone who didn't want her found alive? The official story was unsettling enough. But what came after the discovery of Mitrice Richardson's remains pushed the family's grief into fury. When investigators finally returned her belongings, LaTice Sutton and Michael Richardson noticed disturbing inconsistencies. Some items were missing, others poorly documented. Rumors swirled that not all of Mitrice's bones had even been collected from the canyon. How could evidence from such a sensitive case be treated with such disregard? Experts weighed in publicly, criticizing the sheriff's department. Retired law enforcement officers called the handling of her body a breach of protocol. Civil rights attorneys demanded answers about why the coroner wasn't allowed to process the scene properly. The more the department defended itself, the more the public lost trust. Meanwhile, the media began digging deeper. Reporters uncovered the sheriff's department's history of mishandling vulnerable detainees. The pattern was chilling. People released at odd hours, left to fend for themselves, and sometimes never seen alive again. Mitrice's case wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was part of something larger. For the Richardson family, each new revelation added to the torment. LaTice asked the question that echoed in every interview. Why didn't they just keep her until morning? A simple act that might have saved her daughter's life. But the sheriff's department doubled down. Officials pointed to Mitrice's calm demeanor on the jail video, saying she was lucid, stable, and showed no signs of needing medical care. They claimed they had no legal reason to hold her longer. To them, it was protocol. To her family, it was abandonment disguised as procedure. By late 2010, community outrage had reached the steps of government. Activists staged protests, calling Mitrice's death a product of negligence at best, corruption at worst. Politicians demanded independent reviews. But each inquiry seemed to end the same way. Inconclusive. No clear evidence of foul play. No accountability for the decisions that set Mitrice on her final path. And still, haunting details lingered. Why were her clothes found away from her body? Why were parts of her remains left behind? Why had search teams missed her for nearly a year in a canyon just miles from where she was last seen? Every question only led to darker theories. That Mitrice was never meant to make it out alive, and that someone had worked hard to ensure the truth would remain buried in the canyons. What do you think? Were the inconsistencies simply failures of a sloppy investigation, or signs that someone was actively covering up the truth about Mitrice's death? By 2011, nearly 2 years after Mitrice Richardson's disappearance, the canyon still echoed with questions no one could answer. Her family's grief had hardened into determination, but their fight for justice had become a lonely war against an unyielding system. The discovery of her remains had not brought closure. Instead, it revealed a case riddled with contradictions. Deputies said she walked into the night on her own, but locals in Monte Nido swore she was disoriented, barefoot, and vulnerable. Officials said her body had simply been missed during the massive January 2010 search. But search volunteers insisted that the area where she was later found had been combed. How could hundreds of people and dogs have overlooked her? Then came the lawsuit. LaTice Sutton and Michael Richardson filed a wrongful death claim against Los Angeles County, arguing that deputies' negligence had led directly to their daughter's death. They pointed to LaTice's late-night call, begging the station not to release Mitrice until daylight. They pointed to the missing video footage, the shifting timelines, the mishandled remains. The lawsuit demanded accountability where none had been given. By the summer of 2011, the county quietly settled with the family for $900,000. But no one admitted fault. No one faced charges. To the sheriff's department, the case was resolved. To Mitrice's family, it was blood money. A payment to silence their demands, not justice for their daughter. The settlement didn't quiet the outrage. Activists asked why a young black woman's life seemed to matter so little to those sworn to protect her. Civil rights groups pointed out the pattern of negligence when it came to minorities and vulnerable detainees. Mitrice had become more than a daughter or a friend. She was a symbol of systemic failure, of the dangers of indifference, and of the way lives could slip through cracks that were never accidents at all. Yet even with money exchanged, her family kept pushing. They wanted the truth. They wanted someone held accountable for releasing her into the night. They wanted answers about how she ended up naked and lifeless in a canyon. Her story dismissed as undetermined. The sheriff's department, however, stood firm. No foul play, they said. No evidence of homicide. Just a tragedy in the wilderness. But for anyone who had followed the case, that explanation felt far too convenient. Do you think the county's settlement was an admission of guilt in disguise? Or simply a way to close the book on a case they didn't want to face? Before we continue, please take a moment to like this video, share it with others, subscribe, and click the notification bell. Your support helps keep Mitrice's story alive and ensures that cases like hers are never forgotten. The lawsuit may have been settled, but Mitrice Richardson's story refused to fade into silence. By 2012, her case had become a touchstone for families who felt failed by the very institutions meant to protect them. Everywhere Mitrice Sutton went, she carried her daughter's photo. She spoke at vigils, town halls, and rallies, reminding people that behind every headline was a daughter, a life, a future stolen. She was my baby, Mitrice would say, and they treated her like she was disposable. But even as the years passed, contradictions within the investigation continued to surface. One report noted that some of Mitrice's bones, including her hands and feet, had been left behind in the canyon after deputies collected her remains. It was an unthinkable oversight. When questioned, officials gave vague explanations, but none satisfied her family. How could a proper investigation leave pieces of her behind? Then came another chilling detail. The sheriff's department admitted that some evidence connected to her case, including photos and field notes, had gone missing. For a family already suspicious of a cover-up, this was confirmation that something was terribly wrong. Meanwhile, questions about her mental state were used again and again as a shield. Officials leaned on the narrative of a possible psychotic episode. But friends and family rejected that conclusion, pointing out that Mitrice had no history of mental illness and was functioning well before the strange days leading up to her disappearance. Yes, her behavior was odd, but odd behavior didn't justify abandonment, nor did it explain why her body was found the way it was. By this point, the case had caught the attention of independent investigators and journalists. Some argued that Mitrice's death fit a broader pattern. Vulnerable detainees released at night, later found dead or never found at all. Others suspected she may have crossed paths with someone in the canyon who had darker intentions. And yet, despite mounting pressure, the sheriff's department refused to reopen her case as a homicide. To them, there was no proof of foul play. To the public, the lack of proof felt like the product of an investigation designed to avoid finding it. For the Richardson family, each new revelation deepened the wound. Mitrice wasn't just gone. She had been failed at every step. From her arrest, to her release, to the botched recovery of her remains, her life seemed to have been treated with carelessness that bordered on cruelty. Do you believe the missing evidence and overlooked remains point to incompetence? Or is it proof that someone wanted this case to remain unsolved? By 2013, for years after Mitrice Richardson vanished into the Malibu night, the silence from officials was deafening. Her cause of death remained undetermined. No one was charged. No answers were given. Yet the questions only grew sharper. Independent investigators pointed to troubling gaps in the case. Why was Mitrice released without her phone, wallet, or car keys? Why did deputies ignore her mother's plea to keep her until morning? And why did they later mishandle the discovery of her remains so severely that the cause of death could never be known? The canyon where Mitrice was found added another layer of suspicion. Search teams had combed that same area in January 2010 with helicopters, dogs, and hundreds of volunteers. Yet her remains were discovered there 7 months later, in plain sight of a game trail. How could so many have missed her? Some searchers suggested her body hadn't been there during the initial sweep, implying it had been placed later. Then there was the matter of her clothes. Her jeans and bra were located downhill, away from her skeleton. Her belt was nearby, but her underwear and shoes were never recovered. Animal activity might explain some of this, but investigators admitted there was no clear answer. For her family, It was one more sign that her death wasn't a simple accident in the wilderness. Meanwhile, LaTice Sutton continued her public fight. She gave interviews, joined rallies, and pressed for accountability wherever she could. She was joined by activists and community leaders who saw Mitrice's case as emblematic of a larger problem: the devaluation of Black lives in law enforcement custody. Each year, anniversaries brought vigils. Friends and strangers alike gathered in Malibu to light candles and speak Mitrice's name. Her story became more than a case. It was a movement to demand justice, not only for her, but for anyone lost in the cracks of a system that seemed designed to erase them. But for all the attention, the truth remained elusive. The sheriff's department maintained there was no evidence of foul play. The coroner's office stood by its undetermined ruling, and the canyon, where Mitrice's life ended, offered no more clues. For years on, the haunting reality remained. A young woman had entered police custody alive and never came home. What do you think? Was Mitrice's body overlooked in the canyon during the massive search, or was it placed there later to ensure it would never reveal the full truth? 5 years had passed since Mitrice Richardson disappeared, and still her story carried more questions than answers. For her family, time hadn't dulled the pain, it had sharpened it. Every year that went by without accountability felt like another year of silence protecting those who had failed her. By 2014, community activists were demanding an independent investigation. They pointed to every misstep: deputies ignoring her mother's pleas, releasing Mitrice alone into the night, lying about surveillance footage, failing to search Dark Canyon properly, and disturbing her remains before the coroner arrived. Each one might be dismissed as a mistake. Together, they looked like a pattern. Then came the revelations about missing evidence. Some of Mitrice's remains had been left behind in the canyon. Chain of custody documents were incomplete. Photos taken at the scene went missing. Even her family's legal team admitted the investigation had been so compromised that the full truth might never be known. But LaTice Sutton refused to give up. She continued to hold vigils and push for answers, reminding the world that Mitrice was not a statistic. She was a daughter, a sister, a young woman with dreams and a future. "They want us to forget," LaTice said. "But I will not let them bury her story the way they buried her body." Her father, Michael Richardson, echoed that anger. He publicly accused the sheriff's department of covering their mistakes with silence. To him, the undetermined ruling was nothing more than an excuse to avoid accountability. Theories about what really happened continued to swirl. Some believed Mitrice had suffered a mental health crisis, wandered into the canyon, and succumbed to exposure. Others were convinced she had encountered someone that night, someone who knew those hills and took advantage of her vulnerability. And then there were those who believed the unthinkable, that the truth of what happened to Mitrice lay not in the canyon, but within the very station that had released her. The canyon may have swallowed her body, but the mystery of her death refused to stay buried. What do you think? Was Mitrice's death the tragic result of negligence, or was she silenced to hide something much darker? By 2015, the Richardson family had lived nearly 6 years without answers. The pain was constant, but so was their determination. Every press conference, every vigil, every rally kept Mitrice's story alive, and kept pressure on the sheriff's department that had failed her. Community outrage hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown. Civil rights groups pointed to Mitrice's case as proof of a dangerous pattern: vulnerable people of color being neglected, dismissed, and discarded by law enforcement. Her name became a rallying cry for accountability. But behind the public marches was a more private torment. LaTice Sutton replayed that phone call to the station every night in her mind, her warning, her begging them to hold Mitrice until morning. If they had listened, her daughter might still be alive. That knowledge was unbearable. Michael Richardson, too, refused to let the world forget. He walked the very canyons where his daughter's remains were found, retracing steps, searching for overlooked answers. "She didn't just walk into those mountains and die," he said. "Somebody knows what happened. Somebody out there still holds the truth." The official ruling of undetermined death never changed. But to those who knew Mitrice, the story was clear. She was failed by those who had sworn to protect her, and abandoned in a place where survival was impossible. Whether it was negligence or something darker, the result was the same. A young woman's life cut short, and a family left shattered. Even years later, vigils continued along Pacific Coast Highway. Candles flickered in the night, held by strangers who never met Mitrice but felt the weight of her story. Each flame was a reminder that justice delayed is still justice denied. Her case remains open, but her family fears the truth has been buried with her bones. Still, they keep speaking, keep pressing, keep fighting, because silence, they say, would mean letting her die twice. Do you believe Mitrice Richardson's case will ever be reopened as a homicide? Or has the truth been buried too deep to ever surface? Before we continue, please like this video, share it, subscribe, and click the notification bell. Stories like Mitrice deserve to stay alive, and your support ensures they are never forgotten. 6 years had passed, yet the weight of Mitrice Richardson's story hadn't lifted. By 2016, her case was no longer just a mystery. It had become a symbol. Advocates pointed to it as an example of how institutions failed the very people they were sworn to protect. For Mitrice Sutton, the fight was deeply personal. Every time she looked at her daughter's photos, she saw not only the life Mitrice had lived, but the future stolen from her. She spoke often about her daughter's brilliance, her smile, her passion for psychology. She should have been here, Mitrice said. She should have had a life. The unanswered questions still gnawed at the family. Why had deputies claimed there was no video of Mitrice in the station when footage later surfaced? Why were her remains disturbed before the coroner arrived? Why were some bones left behind in the canyon? And why, after all this time, had the department never once admitted fault? In 2016, the California Attorney General's office quietly reviewed the case. Hopes rose. Finally, there might be an impartial investigation into the handling of Mitrice's disappearance and death. But months later, the conclusion landed like another blow. Insufficient evidence to bring charges against anyone in the sheriff's department. Once again, the official line was that no crime had been proven. For the Richardson family, it was another reminder that justice was slipping further away. The very people they held responsible were the ones controlling the narrative. It's like they're investigating themselves, Michael Richardson said bitterly. And of course, they found no wrongdoing. Still, the family refused to let Mitrice's memory fade. They organized marches in Los Angeles, standing shoulder to shoulder with other families who had lost loved ones in police custody. Together, they demanded change, demanded accountability, demanded that Mitrice's story, and stories like hers, never be forgotten. Her case wasn't just about Malibu anymore. It was about trust, about a system that claimed to protect, but too often abandoned those most in need. And for Mitrice's family, the fight was far from over. What do you think? Was the Attorney General's conclusion a sign there truly wasn't enough evidence, or proof that the system was protecting its own? By 2017, the Richardson family's hope for justice felt like it was running out of road. The California Attorney General's office had closed its review, concluding there wasn't enough evidence to file charges. On paper, the case remained open. In reality, it felt abandoned. For Mitrice Sutton, the ruling was another wound. She had fought for years to make her daughter's name impossible to ignore, to drag the sheriff's department into the light. Yet here they were again, protected, untouchable, their mistakes washed away in official language. Insufficient evidence, they called it. But for Mitrice, the evidence was everywhere. A phone call ignored, a vulnerable young woman released into the night, a body left in the wilderness, disturbed before the coroner could investigate. Still, she refused to go silent. Each year, on the anniversary of Mitrice's disappearance, Mitrice stood with candles and photographs, her voice steady. She told the world who her daughter was, not just how she died. A scholar, a dancer, a woman with dreams of graduate school and a future that was stolen before it could unfold. Michael Richardson took a harder stance. He spoke bluntly, accusing deputies of covering their failures with lies. They're never going to admit what happened, he said, but we know, and we'll keep telling it until everybody else knows too. Public interest in Mitrice's story continued to surface in waves. Documentaries, podcasts, and new specials revisited her case, drawing in new audiences. Each time, the same themes emerged: negligence, contradictions, unanswered questions. And each time, the sheriff's department doubled down on the same refrain: no evidence of foul play. But in the spaces between those official statements lived the real story. A young woman who entered custody alive and never came home. A family forced to live with undetermined as the only explanation. And a canyon that still held its silence. 8 years had passed since Mitrice's death. The flames of public outrage dimmed at times, but they never died completely. Her name still appeared on protest signs, still rang out in chants, still stood as a warning of how easily a life could be erased when institutions chose convenience over humanity. What do you think? Does the passage of time make it less likely the truth will come out? Or do cases like Mitrice prove that justice delayed can still be justice found? By 2018, nearly a decade after Mitrice Richardson's disappearance, the shock of her story had transformed into something larger, a symbol of how easily trust in the system can collapse. Her family had not stopped fighting. Latice Sutton still spoke at vigils, often with candles flickering in the Malibu night, her daughter's photo held high. "Mitrice mattered," she said, her voice steady even as her eyes carried the weight of years. "And we will not stop saying her name." Michael Richardson, more fiery in tone, told anyone who would listen that his daughter's case was proof of systemic failure. He accused the sheriff's department of hiding behind procedure to mask their mistakes. "They failed her, and then they failed us," he said, "and they're hoping people forget. But we won't forget." Documentaries, podcasts, and news specials began to revisit the case. Each time, Mitrice's story reached new audiences. Listeners and viewers who had never heard her name before were suddenly gripped by the image of a young woman walking into the dark, never to return. The pattern was always the same: negligence, contradictions, missing evidence, unanswered questions. And yet, official records remained unchanged. Her cause of death, undetermined. Her case, open but inactive. No homicide ruling, no accountability. Still, the ripple effect was undeniable. Activists invoked Mitrice's name in broader movements about police accountability and the treatment of vulnerable detainees. She became part of a larger conversation, not just about what happened in Malibu, but about what happens across America when institutions decide some lives don't matter as much as others. For the Richardson family, this was both comforting and painful. Comforting, because strangers cared enough to keep her memory alive. Painful, because none of it brought answers about what really happened in those final hours. 9 years later, the canyon was still silent, the sheriff's department was still defensive, and the truth about Mitrice's death remained locked in shadows. Do you think public pressure and media attention can still force new answers in a case this old? Or has the system already buried the truth too deep? 10 years after Mitrice Richardson vanished, her story still refused to fade. Each anniversary drew crowds to Malibu, where family, friends, and strangers gathered with candles to honor her memory. They spoke her name aloud, promising that she would never be forgotten, not as long as her case remained unresolved. For the Richardson family, those vigils were both a comfort and a wound. Comfort because people still cared. Wound because a decade had passed and the same haunting questions remained. Why was Mitrice released alone into the night? Why were her remains mishandled? Why did evidence go missing? And why, after all this time, did officials still cling to undetermined instead of admitting that something went terribly wrong? The sheriff's department held firm. No foul play, no crime, just a tragedy in the wilderness. But the family, activists, and countless supporters disagreed. They saw a pattern of neglect, of contradictions, of failures too glaring to ignore. And they refused to stop asking, who benefits from keeping the truth buried? Meanwhile, Mitrice's story began to appear on protest signs and in chants at rallies far from Malibu. Her name was spoken alongside others who had been failed in police custody. She had become more than a case. She had become part of a movement. Yet for her family, it always came back to one thing: Mitrice herself. A daughter, a scholar, a dancer, a young woman with dreams cut short. They wanted people to remember not just how she died, but who she was. And so, even after a decade of silence from officials, the fight for truth pressed on, because forgetting was never an option. Backhand index pointing right, do you believe justice can still be won for Mitrice Richardson, even after all these years? Or has her case become proof that some truths are never meant to surface? Before we continue, if you believe stories like Mitrice must stay alive, please like this video, share it with others, subscribe, and click the notification bell. Your voice helps keep pressure on those who would rather the world forget. The years after Mitrice Richardson's disappearance taught her family a painful truth. When a case is left unresolved, the grief never ends. It shifts, it hardens, but it never leaves. For LaTice Sutton, every milestone was a reminder of what her daughter lost. Birthdays that would never be celebrated. Graduations and weddings that would never come. She should be here, LaTice said often, her voice steady but her eyes heavy. She should have had a life. Michael Richardson carried the loss differently. More outward, more raw. He demanded accountability, raising his voice in interviews, calling the sheriff's department out by name. To him, the failure wasn't just in losing Mitrice, but in the indifference that followed. They treated her like she was nothing, he said, and that's something I'll never forgive. For many families, an unresolved case feels like a wound that never heals. The Richardsons lived it daily. They replayed the moments over and over. The call to the station begging deputies to hold her, the grainy video of her pacing in the lobby, the discovery of her remains in Dark Canyon. Each memory brought both clarity and torment. And then there were the what-ifs. What if deputies had given her a ride? What if the coroner had been allowed to process the scene properly? What if evidence hadn't gone missing? Each unanswered question built into a wall of silence that the family could not break through. Mitrice's case also sparked something larger, a reflection on how law enforcement treats vulnerable people. Activists pointed to her story as proof that the system needs reform, that lives too often slip through cracks that should never exist. Her name became part of a broader demand. Accountability for every person lost in custody, forgotten in paperwork, or dismissed as undetermined. But for her family, activism could never replace truth. They wanted to know, once and for all, what really happened in those hours after she left the Lost Hills station. And until they did, justice would remain out of reach. Do you think Mitrice's case should be reopened with today's investigative tools? Or has too much evidence already been lost to time? It has been more than a decade since Mitrice Richardson walked out of the Lost Hills Sheriff's Station and into the Malibu night. She never came home. Her family has lived every day since with a wound that never healed. They have fought for answers, for accountability, for justice. But the canyon has remained silent, and the system has remained closed. Her official cause of death still reads undetermined. Her case remains open, but stagnant. Yet Mitrice's story refuses to be erased. Each vigil, each candle, each chant of her name keeps her memory alive. She has become more than a daughter lost. She has become a symbol of resilience, a call for accountability, a reminder of how institutions can fail the very people they are sworn to protect. Her mother, LaTice Sutton, still speaks with the same quiet strength. I will never stop fighting for her. Her father, Michael Richardson, still refuses to let her name fade into silence. They want people to forget, but we won't. Not ever. For those who hear her story now, for those who see her face and learn her name, the responsibility is ours too. To remember, to question, to demand more from those in power. Because Mitrice Richardson was not just a case file. She was a young woman with dreams, with family, with a future that should have stretched far beyond September 2009. And though her life ended in shadows, her memory shines like a light, demanding that we not look away. Justice delayed is not justice denied, not if her story continues to be told. What do you think? Will Mitrice's case ever find justice? Or is the fight now about making sure no other family suffers the same silence? Before we finish this story, please like, share, subscribe, and click the notification bell. Keeping Mitrice's story alive ensures that her name, and her truth, will never be forgotten. Time has passed, but Mitrice Richardson's story has never slipped into silence. More than a decade later, Her name still echoes in vigils, protests, documentaries, and conversations about justice. Her disappearance, her death, and the failures that surrounded her case have become a warning and a demand. A warning of what happens when institutions dismiss vulnerability. A demand that no one else should ever be left behind the way she was. For her family, the pain will never fade, but neither will their fight. Mitrice and Michael Richardson continue to speak their daughter's name, ensuring the world remembers she was more than a mystery. She was a scholar, a dancer, a daughter, a life full of promise. And for those who hear her story now, the responsibility continues. To carry her name, to share her truth, to demand better, because justice doesn't end with verdicts. Sometimes, it begins with memory. Mitrice walked into the darkness that night in Malibu, but her story became a light that challenges us to see, to question, to never accept silence where answers should be. In memory of Mitrice Richardson. This story is dedicated to the life and memory of Mitrice Richardson. She was a daughter, a scholar, a dancer, and a young woman with dreams and a bright future. Though her life was cut short, her story continues to shine a light on justice, accountability, and the importance of never forgetting those who are gone too soon. We honor her by speaking her name and keeping her memory alive. What do you believe is Mitrice's true legacy? Is it the unanswered questions of her case, or the way her name continues to inspire change and accountability? If you believe her story should never be forgotten, please like this video, share, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell. Your voice helps keep Mitrice's memory alive and ensures stories like hers are told again and again.